So welcome everyone to this webinar on civic space and coronavirus. My name is Rowan Popplewell and I'm a policy manager at Bond and I lead our work on civic space. I'm also a co-chair of a new working group that we're setting up on civic space alongside Patricia Melendez from Article 19, and I'm going to be chairing the session today. So unfortunately, one of our presenters has had to drop out, so we've got a spare 15 minutes, so we can either devote that to more discussion and questions and answers, or we can finish early, but we'll see how the discussion is going. So before we start, I'll just begin with a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'll provide a broad overview of the issue and say why we're here today, and then I will introduce our two excellent speakers. So on housekeeping, we'll have our two speakers going first and then we'll have questions afterwards. You'll see at the bottom of your screens there's a question and answer function. So if you could please write your questions in there as the speakers are talking, we can then come to them at the end. And we can either read them out or we can get you to answer them get you to ask them directly. You can also use the chat box throughout the presentations to provide your thoughts and reactions, and we welcome those. And I should also say that we're going to be recording this webinar and it will be edited and uploaded afterwards. So I'm going to start with a brief overview. So I think it's fair to say that this is an interesting and critical moment when it comes to civic space and the promotion and protection of civil society freedoms. Restrictions and pressures on civil society have grown hugely in the last 15 years, but in the past few months we've seen one country after another introduce unprecedented measures that limit our rights and freedoms in order to curb the spread of coronavirus. But as we know, the picture is a lot more complicated. Although we've seen restrictions increase, we've also seen civic activism increase as people from around the world have come together online and in the streets to express solidarity and to speak out against discrimination and injustice. So all of this prompts a few big questions, which I hope this webinar will address. So first of all, I think the main question is whether and how COVID-19 is exacerbating existing trends. So the past few years have been characterized by rising authoritarianism, right-wing populism. We've seen an increase in harassment and even killings of human rights defenders. And we've also seen widespread exclusion and discrimination of marginalized groups. But I think there's a flip side to this, and a big question for me is, does the pandemic present us with opportunities to challenge unequal power structures, to address the drivers of closing space? Does it give us an opportunity to challenge negative narratives on civil society? And how can we support civic activism to flourish and to grow? So I'm just going to say a little bit about why we're holding this webinar now. This is largely because we're launching a new working group on civic space here at Bond. This isn't a new policy area for us. We've worked on civic space issues since 2013. And in that year, we saw a dramatic contraction of space for advocacy and campaigning here in the UK with the introduction of the Lobbying Act. And since then, we've seen further restrictions put in place, such as the introduction of anti-advocacy clauses. And I think everyone who works in policy and advocacy here in the UK will recognise that there has been a reduction in space for and quality of engagement with the government on policy making. So at Bond, our focus so far has been to encourage the UK to lead by example and to prevent the restrictions that are developed and created here being copied by governments elsewhere. And this has particularly been an issue when it comes to counter-terrorism legislation, and that's an area that we've been working on with our members over the past few years. But we also want to influence how the government addresses civic space issues overseas. Many of our members have been working on this issue for a long time, both individually and through other Bond working groups, such as our conflict policy group and our sanctions and counter-terrorism groups. But we thought it was time to create a new working group that focuses specifically on civic space issues. And we believe that this issue has never been more timely and more urgent, and there are two reasons for this. The first is coronavirus. As I said, we think it's reinforced existing challenges and drivers, but it's also creating new opportunities. And here in the UK, one of those new opportunities is the creation of a DFID Rights and Governance Task Force. And this working group is going to be one of the main ways that our members and other people within civil society can contribute to the work of this task force. The second issue is around the agenda of the current government. So we know that issues such as media freedom are a priority for them, and so we want to shape how they respond to that. But also the merger of the Foreign Office and DFID is creating risks and opportunities. Both the Foreign Office and DFID have worked on aspects of this agenda, both together and separately. And I think there's scope here to look at what an integrated Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office policy will look like, and how we can shape it as civil society. So by creating this new group, we want to create a space where those of you who are working on these issues can come together to share information and learning from your advocacy and programmes, but also a space where you can collaborate to influence the UK government and the new Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers. We have two great speakers, both of whom have recently published new research on civic space, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that. So first, we're going to hear from Mandeep Tiwana, who is the Chief Programmes Officer at Civicus, and they're a global civil society alliance that I'm sure all of you will have heard of. He specialises in legislation relating to the core civil society freedoms of expression, association and peaceful assembly, and he has written extensively on the intersection between civil society, development and international affairs. And Mandeep is going to discuss the latest Civicus State of Civil Society report, which looks at the impact of COVID-19 on global civil society and calls for activists and civil society organisations to be partners in the struggle to build a post-pandemic world. Then we're going to hear from Poonam Joshi, who is a Consultant Director at the Funders Initiative for Civil Society, or FIX. She has over 20 years experience working on a range of human rights issues, and she's previously worked at the Global Fund for Human Rights, the Sigrid Rising Trust and Amnesty International UK. So Poonam is going to share the findings from FIX's latest report, which looks at the drivers of closing space and how funders can work with activists to disrupt them. The research was written prior to the pandemic, but she's going to reflect on the extent to which coronavirus has reinforced these drivers. And you can, I'll share links to both reports in the chat box. So with that, I will hand over to Mandeep.
Thank you, Rawan, and good morning and good afternoon to colleagues here. Thanks for the introduction, Rawan. As you mentioned, the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic has really accelerated existing fault lines in our societies, whether it was inequality or whether it was exclusion, or whether it was repression. Coronavirus has provided an opportunity for those who don't believe in values of openness or who don't believe in values of good governance to further accelerate their work. And it's also created more challenges for those who are excluded, and this is something that we've raised in our State of Civil Society report. Now, but there's also an opportunity, and I think I and several of my colleagues at Civicus believe that there is cause for cautious optimism, that because there's many conversations that are happening around the world on creating greener and fairer societies, and some leaders have taken very empathetic approaches in how they respond to coronavirus, and they appear to have done better by involving civil society. So civic space is really important, particularly as we all grapple with this big challenge to our way of life, and our leaders are taking life and death decisions, and it's really important that the public has access to information on the basis of which leaders are taking decisions, but also public is able to shape these decisions and hold decision makers to account. So it's doubly important, particularly in times of crisis, that we have civic space, although the tendency sometimes is to try to create a false dichotomy between public safety and civic freedoms, and I'm going to discuss a little bit more about this. Lena is going to be helping me with some slides that I put together. So maybe we'll go to the next slide and just dwell a little bit on civic space. So civic space, broadly speaking, is the ability of people and organizations to shape the political, social, and economic structures around them. It really hinges on the ability to communicate, to organize, and to come together. And it's protected by three civic freedoms, which we believe are absolutely integral to civic space. These are the freedoms of expression, the freedom of peaceful assembly, and the freedom of association. They are part of international law. They are there's a whole wealth of literature that explains the limits of limits of these freedoms, or the limits of restrictions on these freedoms, rather, I would say, and they're also part of the constitutions of almost every country. And indeed, civic space is the bedrock of an open and democratic society. So, can we just go to the next slide, please? So what is civic space? And our participatory platform, the Civicus Monitor, which is a research partnership with over 20 organizations from around the world and draws on several sources of information, found that in December 2019, when COVID-19 was just starting to bubble up, that actually the civic space scenario around the world was quite worrying. And according to our research, only 3% of the world's population live in countries where these three core civic freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly are adequately protected. And even in these countries, there are challenges. Of course, we want to present a more nuanced picture, and civil society, even in more challenging environments, has managed to navigate the restrictions and been able to make changes. Yet it's important to locate the situation of civic space in a broadly disenabling environment, despite international commitments, despite international law, despite several multilateral institutions speaking about the importance of civic space. So these are some 43 mostly small countries where 3% of the world's population are living, and I think that is something that we really need to look at. And as I'm going to talk a little bit further in my presentation, because of COVID-19 concerns, a number of governments have put in place emergency measures, and this space for civil society or civic space has been further restricted. But broadly speaking, this is where the trend lay even before COVID-19 restrictions hit us. So perhaps if you can go to the next slide, Lena. So what happened was, as soon as COVID-19 started to influence public policy, a number of governments started to put in place a lot of emergency powers, and police were given increased coercive powers to enforce lockdowns and restrictions. Our colleagues at ICNL have documented that in over 80 countries, there were emergency measures that were put in place that limited people's freedom of movement and access to information. And in many places, the police, exceeded their remits and also engaged in violent behavior to prevent people from moving around, and also use it as an excuse to engage in increased police brutality. Now, we are at a stage where a lot of governments have eased their lockdowns, but it's important to keep in mind that these emergency measures have played a part in creating an atmosphere where restrictions on civic space have been sort of normalized. And in addition to that, there have been moves by many governments. In fact, on one extreme, of course, some governments have actively scrubbed information about how they responded to the pandemic from the internet to prevent any criticism of their response. Others have basically persecuted people who have spoken about the response of governments, the tardiness in actions. On social media, they have summoned them to police stations. They have instituted fines against them, and in some cases, they have issued instructions to journalists not to publish critical information. In some instances, there have been circulars that have been issued, under more benign ways of saying that false information should not be circulated, but yet it has severe implications for censorship that has taken place. And this is, whilst on one hand censorship is taking place, a number of governments have also ramped up their propaganda to show the narrative of their response. And this is particularly true of countries where you have right-wing populist leaders who have been doing a lot of grandstanding around their response to COVID-19, which has been exposed by the number of deaths that have taken place in their countries and people who've been affected. Along with this, censorship and restrictions on access to information and media freedoms, we found that there's also increased moves towards surveillance. And again, this has been done in the name of contact tracing. A number of apps have been put in place around the world, which of course again have been introduced through public safety considerations and couched in public safety terms of needing to control the spread of the virus. But these apps again provide other segues into restricting people's rights and to monitoring the activities of organizations and groups, particularly those that are critical of government responses. And of course, in more extreme cases, there've been judicial persecution of activists for criticizing the state, a number of protest movements. And if you might recall, 2019 really was a year of protest, whether from Chile to Ecuador to Lebanon to India to Hong Kong. A number of protest movements provided a new hope for creating more equal, more fairer, more democratic societies. Now, some of those protest movements, of course, have had to be suspended. Yet, as we see in the United States and beyond, the protests around Black Lives Matter and racial injustice have provided, of course, a new impetus. But yet, we are seeing that in many instances there is persecution for people for exercising their civic freedoms, and the response of the police has been very disproportionate in many instances. So again, this is all playing into the COVID-19 larger narrative, and of course it depends on the country context, yet it's something to keep in mind. And worryingly, in some countries, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, and in other places in Asia, which have populations of prisoners of conscience, there are concerns that activists and those who are imprisoned for their faith and for their beliefs, for their work, are also at risk in prison due to COVID-19 spread, and in some instances they may deliberately be denied bail or denied the benefit of the government release programs. Next slide, please. So within the current scenario, I've just wanted to share 4 implications that might be of interest. As we are seeing, there is a lot that is going on, and as public safety is coming up against fundamental civic freedoms, there is a danger of subversion of democratic processes. There is a danger that certain authoritarian leaders might use the COVID-19 emergency, as some states might even go back into lockdown as COVID-19 spreads before we can find a cure or a vaccine for it. So there's a real need for us to be vigilant of how democratic processes might be suspended by certain leaders to prolong their stay in power. As COVID-19 has shown, the real impacts have been felt by those who were already excluded, those who were already impoverished, those who were already discriminated, and especially the closing down of economies rather abruptly in some instances has really led to mass starvation. It's led to people being denied access to medical facilities and the ability to earn their livelihoods. And these groups have, of course, borne the brunt of the attacks, and civil society activists and organizations that have spoken out in favor of their rights or who have sought to oppose these abrupt measures have also been put at further risk. So I think that's something that we need to be concerned about. Groups that work on the rights of migrant workers, that work on the rights of LGBTQI communities, that are challenging violence against women, are in need of greater support and protection, particularly in this time. And of course, in some countries, particularly in the early days of COVID-19 restrictions, there were very heavy restrictions placed on the right to movement and the right to peaceful assembly. So, which led to innovative forms of organizing, with people organizing a lot online, and also connecting and doing mobilization actions from their houses or from their apartment buildings. And I think this is something that we need to continue to keep up the momentum, and particularly as the urgency of the Black Lives Matter uh, protests has shown, that we need to continue our mobilization. We need to challenge uh, unfairness and persecution and discrimination in all its forms. Yet we will need to do this in more innovative ways, and also be able to organize and mobilize in a safe manner, which does not create additional risks of COVID-19. And lastly, the biggest concern that we have is really that, censorship and overarching surveillance could be here to stay for a while. As it often happens, bad practices have a tendency to linger on, and this really is a moment uh, which is sort of similar to 9/11, when we saw an increase in the security discourses by several governments, and where they sought to justify torture and extraordinary renditions. And we need to be very, very vigilant that under the garb or the guise of COVID-19 concerns, that censorship does not become normalized, that overarching surveillance does not get normalized, that repressive state apparatuses are not able to repurpose these public safety measures to advance their own agendas, to silence people who don't agree with them. So that's something to keep. That's something that we have to be extremely, extremely vigilant about. So next slide, please. So looking ahead, there are a number of things that we can do, which we've highlighted in our 2020 State of Civil Society report. Uh, uh, is I think one is, we need to ask governments to adopt a human rights approach to all measures. There was a letter that we issued in April, which was signed by over 650 civil society organizations, urging governments to adopt a human rights approach. Now, this means that governments must be open in their policy responses. They must share information proactively. They must involve civil society in their responses. They also must ensure that those who are excluded, those who are vulnerable, adequate measures are made put in place to ensure that they are not further persecuted, or they're not further uh, challenged in this time. And importantly, any restrictions on civic freedoms must stand the test of proportionality and necessity in a democratic society, as mandated by law. And it's particularly important to ensure accountability of law enforcement agencies in this time. For us as civil society, we really believe it's absolutely important that as governments are putting in place policies and plans to deal with COVID-19 restrictions, as they're debating through uh, through through measures to catalyze the economy, as they're debating through measures to safeguard economic activities, or as that it's important that civil society has a seat at the table, so that we ensure that the funds flow to those who need them the most. It's not and a repeat of the 2008 scenario, where during the financial crisis, where a lot of big corporations were the recipients of government funds and bailout plans, rather than vulnerable people, which has led us into a situation of extreme inequality that we face today, is not repeated. So it's really important that we have a seat at the policy-making table. It's really important also for us to continue to strengthen the case for multilateralism, as the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that it very easily crosses borders, just like issues like conflict, or issues like poverty or climate change. The impacts are felt far beyond their borders. So we really need to work towards a multilateral system, strengthen the independence and autonomy of international institutions, independence and autonomy, both from very powerful governments and also from profit-oriented interests of big business. And it's quite strange, because different governments have different positions on multilateralism. Some want multilateralism for trade, some want multilateralism for aid, and a few of them that believe in democratic values actually use multilateralism for human rights. But we should insist that if you want multilateralism for trade or for aid, then multilateralism for human rights go hand in hand with all of this. So that's really critical, that at this time our international institutions are properly resourced and also allowed to be autonomous so that they can serve humanity at large. And of course, it's important for us to prioritize solidarity and sharing of resources. That's a mistake that on the slide it's come twice, but I think we can't emphasize it enough. And especially organizations that are better resourced, it's really important that we continue to share our resources, to also work with our sister organizations to support them, particularly in this need, as a lot of civil society is having to face several different challenges due to disruptions in programming activities, disruptions in convenings, and we've been working with a number of funders to be flexible, to listen to civil society. But it's also important to ensure that civil society organizations that are working on the ground, that they get the resources that they need immediately, and a significant proportion of resources actually flow to them on the ground, and so that and are not interrupted along the way. So that's absolutely critical. And I'm of course happy to take any questions, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to share some of these reflections.
Thank you very much, Mandeep. So I think we'll move on to Poonam now. But if you have any questions for Mandeep, please write them in the question and answer box, and we'll come to them after Poonam has finished her presentation. Thank you very much.
So I'm just checking, can you see me? Because I can't see myself.
Yes, we can see you.
Great, okay, thank you. So thank you very much, Rowan, and thank you to Bond for inviting me to speak, and good afternoon to everyone who's joined the webinar. First of all, I just wanted to say it's great to hear that Bond is continuing its work on closing civic space and establishing this group at this critical moment. There really couldn't be a more critical moment. I was on a DFID working group conversation at the end of last week, and Tom Carruthers, who many of you will know, who's written extensively on democracy and governance, talked about our concerns about closing civic space over the last 5 years, but there have been kind of more restrictions on closing civic space in the last 2 months than there have in the last 5 years. So this moment is really pivotal. I'm going to be speaking about emerging research that we've been doing around the drivers of closing space. Mandeep's done a brilliant job of kind of setting the context and kind of broad trends. And where a number of funders have been focusing on over the kind of last couple of years is kind of understanding how we move beyond the kind of manifestations of closing space and start looking at responding to the root causes. So I'm going to be speaking about that, and in particular about the way that counterterrorism and security laws and the discourse around terrorism and security has been a key driver of restricting civic space, and how is that going to change in a sort of post-pandemic context. I just very briefly want to introduce FIX for those of you who are new to the organisation. The Funders Initiative for Civil Society is a donor affinity group. That means we're a knowledge and learning platform, predominantly for human rights funders. Our members include Ford Foundation, Open Society, Oak, Sigrid Rousing Trust, but also a number of grassroots funders. We were set up 4 years ago to help independent philanthropy, and particularly human rights funders, on how to respond more strategically to the issue of closing civic space. Lena, if you go to the next slide, please. So why was civic space of concern to funders in particular? I'd say for many of us, although there have been attacks, restrictions on a range of civic actors, particularly social justice movements for years, the entry point for a lot of funders was the waves of restrictive NGO laws that were introduced from the mid-2000s onwards, but kind of really caught our attention from about 2012 onwards. So these were laws that sought to prevent or impede flows of funding across borders, but it also gave authorities powers to harass NGOs. The epicenter of of those waves of NGO laws were in Asia and Africa, and the image on the right captures just some of the range of countries that were affected in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. For funders, our main tool of supporting social change is funding. So it's perhaps no surprise that that was at the moment that civic space became an issue for us. But I'd say even more so than that, we were really worried by what we were seeing as the increasing exhaustion and isolation of the partners that we funded, as they faced wave after wave of different forms of restrictions. Yes, NGO laws, but also restrictions on right to protest, on right to expression, and also smear attacks and hostility. And we had real concerns what this meant for the future of human rights and social justice in many countries. I joined FIX in 2019 after almost a decade in philanthropy. And it was a moment where for several years we'd been following trends. We had been experimenting with new programs. We had been upping our funding for protection and security. We'd been trying some innovative approaches around narratives. But I think both the philanthropic foundations and government funders realized that the scale of our response did not match the scale of closing space that we were seeing. I think at some point from about 2016 onwards, we also realized that these attacks on civil society were not specific, but were part of broader trends around democratic erosion and a sort of creep towards autocracy and illiberal populism. And we were sort of at a kind of pivotal moment going, what do we do next? And at FIX, what we decided to do, Lena, if you could turn to the next slide, was look at it through the lens of the future of civic space. There was a sense that so many of the assumptions that underpinned our work as human rights funders, but our understanding of civic space were based on assumptions from the post-Cold War era. That democracy was on the rise, that civil society was increasingly valued in a growing number of nations, that tech was a force for good, that economic liberalism sort of went hand in hand with democratic liberalism. And I think the crises we've seen over the last decade in terms of the economic crisis, deepening inequality, cultural wars, indicated that this was perhaps no longer the direction of travel. And what we decided to do before we looked at how to approach civic space over the next decade was sort of examine the convergence of trends we were seeing. And both from the trends that I've already mentioned, but what would happen when they converged with the spectre of climate and ecological crisis and the increasingly malign use of digital tech and AI. And what we realized, we were at a tipping point that required us to think differently about civic space and the role of funders. Next slide, please, Lena. So what we did was we interviewed 150 civil society representatives, movement leaders, academics, UN experts, journalists, and funders around the trends that we thought were going to be most contested over the next decade. So these were the actors working around challenging economic power, environmental protection, intersectional inequality, impacts of climate change and responses. So that ranges from the humanitarian response to migrants' rights to the counterterrorism responses being introduced by governments. We were looking at the future of technology and media, and we were also looking at the future of human rights and democracy. And we asked the people that we interviewed about the trends most likely to affect them in the future, what they saw as the key drivers of civic space now, but what they anticipated changing, and what they needed funders to do to defend and expand civic space. Lena, next slide, please. I'd say that there were two key takeaways for us from the research. I think the first really striking one, and this goes back to our kind of assumptions about the direction of travel politically and economically that the world was going in, is that we were entering an era of crises. All of the trends that I have referenced were creating a sort of perfect storm, creating unprecedented levels of flux in the political, the economic, the societal landscape. And the reality was that some of the most problematic governments and regressive social movements and economic actors were much better at forecasting than progressive philanthropy and civil society. And many of them, you know, if we're talking about states, we're talking about states like China, Russia, Israel, where we're talking about social movements, we're talking about the far right, the religious right. In economic actors, we're talking about some of the kind of worst offending sectors, agribusiness, fossil fuel sectors. These actors already had tried and tested strategies for how to use these crises to advance their own agendas and visions, a kind of shock doctrine response. And the challenge for progressive civil society was not that we didn't have our own visions of the future, but the challenge was in playing catch up to these regressive actors, partly because of the way progressive philanthropy funds progressive civil actors in much more short term and projectized sort of ways, but also because of the scale of closing civic space. And the necessity of keeping that space open was both to keep the space open for these visionaries who would ensure the future had democracy and human rights and social justice and environmental protection at the heart. But arriving at that destination was going to mean taking people with us and building public majorities on the grand challenges that lay ahead, but particularly climate and ecological crises and growing economic inequality. And to do that, progressive civil society can't operate on the margins and just within the civic space that states permit. So that was the first takeaway. The second was, I think, for us, enormous clarity about common drivers of closing civic space. None of the drivers that I'm about to mention are new. We were all aware of them, but I think what was striking was the degree to which they affected all of those groups, all of those categories and sectors that we mentioned. So the first is securitisation. That's the use of counterterrorism, national security laws, and the discourse to restrict and criminalise civic freedoms, and I'll be coming to speak more about that in a moment. There were threats to democracy, and many people right across the board talk about being on the receiving end of attacks, harassment, or just an erosion of the broader environment that was led by far right and religious right actors who were seeking to weaken rule of law, erode democratic pluralism, often impose traditional values, and wage aggressive anti-rights campaigns. And then the final driver was around the concentration and abuse of economic power, which manifested itself in a range of ways. So everything from undue influence in politics and corporations preventing states from regulating the human rights and environmental harms of, for example, the fossil fuel industry. You had particular sectors actively complicit in targeting environmental and labour rights activists. But we also saw was the rise of aggressive philanthropy, and many of these actors using their accumulated wealth to bankroll campaigns to undermine support for migrants' rights or women's rights or LGBTI rights. Next slide, please. And what we had was digital tech cutting across all of these drivers. And I think what was interesting was that many people often kind of were more expert on one particular set of drivers because it was seen as the sort of dominant driver that affected their work. But this sort of realization that actually what most people were experiencing was the convergence of these three trends, and actually some of the gravest restrictions of civic freedoms were taking place when all of these three drivers were interplaying. And so for us, on the basis of this work, we're currently working with a group of human rights funders to design a framework for funders on how philanthropy can play a role in not only just responding to the manifestations of these drivers, but actually disrupting these systemic drivers and seeing if it's possible to reform them in ways that would actually deepen both democracy and civic space. And I'd say in that work, we are seeing huge opportunity, particularly around the economic power strand. I think around socio-cultural and political threats, although the far-right populist right have very much tried to capitalise on this crisis, we're also seeing that they're actually faring quite badly, as are some authoritarian actors. But for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus on securitisation as a driver, where some of the most significant challenges lie. So I wanted to, before I look at the impact of the pandemic on this driver, I wanted to just take a few moments to talk about what we mean by securitisation and the trends we were seeing in the run-up to the beginning of this year. So of all the drivers that we've been examining, we've been anticipating that securitisation is going to have the greatest impact on civic space and democracy in a post-COVID world. And by securitisation, we mean the counter-terrorism and national security laws and frameworks and agencies and discourse that have developed extensively since 9/11. But securitisation we also mean by what we're seeing is a sort of creeping expansion of the issues that are brought under the rubric of securitisation. So going from kind of hard counter-terrorism responses to starting with states starting to look at issues around humanitarian response and migrants' rights through a securitised lens. And we'll see how that is sort of continuing to evolve through the pandemic. So looking at this slide, although we knew securitisation was an issue prior to the pandemic, I think for many civil society actors and funders across sectors, it was viewed predominantly as a niche issue. But I think the data that we've got on this slide tells a different story. So where did this driver originate from? It's very much rooted in the proliferation of laws that were introduced by governments around the world post 9/11. And between 2001 to 2018, you see 140 governments adopting counter-terrorism legislation, and under real pressure to demonstrate how they're playing their role in combating the global war on terror. I think a sort of very under-researched area, though I know civicists have written about this, is the impact that this has had not just on peace and security organisations or humanitarian organisations, but the misuse and abuse of this legislation to crack down on civic actors more broadly. So the data there from Frontline Defenders shows that 58% of the cases that they dealt with concerned human rights defenders, civil society groups and political activists who were targeted using security and counter-terrorism legislation. And the UN Special Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism and Human Rights tracked over a 13-year period that 2/3 of the communications she received were in relation to attacks on human rights and environmental defenders and other civic actors. And I just want to sort of draw your attention to this quote from the UN Special Rapporteur, where she kind of underlines that the scale of the use of these laws against civil society indicates that this isn't a random or incidental aspect, but it's kind of hardwired into the misuse of counter-terrorism measures. Many governments are not inadvertently using these laws to restrict civil society. They are deliberately using these laws to restrict civil society. If I could have the next slide, please, Lena. And that abuse of these frameworks and measures are very much sort of rooted in the failure of the UN to define key terms such as terrorism and extremism. And that, combined with the global imperative to combat terrorism, has allowed not only authoritarian governments, but sometimes Western democracies to characterize criticism and dissent as a threat to national security. And we've seen that no region of the world is immune from this trend. So at the gravest end of the spectrum, we've seen threats to national security used to justify surveillance and arrest of protesters, use of torture, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, house raids and travel bans, harassment of journalists, and delegitimization of civil society as terrorists or enemies of the state. And to kind of give us a range of the spectrum of states using there, we saw the attacks on journalists and academics as threats to national security in Turkey is incredibly well documented. But perhaps more shocking for many people was the realisation that security authorities in the UK had categorised XR as a prescribed terrorist group last year. Could I have the next slide, please, Lena? Securitisation has also had a particular impact for humanitarian and development actors because of their operation in conflict or crisis affected zones. And Rowan, you mentioned the sanctions working group earlier, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the challenges I'm outlining here, from restrictions on cross-border funding to travel bans to denial of access to financial services, and also restricted access to very vulnerable populations. Next slide, please. So, how does COVID-19 affect securitisation? The devastating impact of the pandemic, as Mandeep outlined, the impact that's had on the most vulnerable, combined with the recession that's already underway, is going to mean that it's absolutely imperative to keep civic space open for a range of civic society actors, but in particular development and humanitarian work, given the steep increase in economic inequality that we're seeing. We're still trying to understand what the legacy is going to be of the pandemic. And an example of what we thought and how that's changed in recent weeks is, I'd say, in the first few weeks of the pandemic, we were anticipating a massive decline in protest. We were presuming that states would use new legislation to suppress protest, but also that people would be too frightened to protest. And I think in terms of what we've seen in protests resuming in Lebanon, Hong Kong, US, even UK, that isn't the case. So I think instead of a sort of blanket ban on protest or a decline, we're going to see an incredibly sort of contestation around this area. So that's just one example of how within sort of recent weeks we've had to kind of pivot and recalibrate our understanding of what's about to happen. The overarching challenge that we're seeing, that Mandeep has also referred to, is what's been described as the kind of epidemic of new emergency powers that states can now use to restrict civic space. States haven't only adapted powers gained post 9/11, but through the slide that you can see on ICNL's COVID-19 Civic Freedom Tracker, over 80 states have declared states of emergency. Many of those are working with private tech and security firms to develop their capability for mass surveillance. And those with autocratic tendencies, China, Hungary, Russia, Israel, India, Uganda, are already using the crisis as a pretext to extend their powers and suppress civic freedoms in a number of ways that Mandeep has outlined. The other point I'd like to make around emergency powers, democracy and civic space, what we know from previous emergencies is that even though many of the measures that states have introduced incorporate sunset clauses, the reality is that we've seen states are often loath to give up new powers that they've accrued. When you see prolonged states of emergency, which might be the case with the nature of the pandemic, we also see a correlation between the length of the emergency powers and violations, very grave violations of a range of human rights issues. But I think we're also going to see massive challenges in terms of accountability. Some of the states who've introduced these emergency powers have openly declared that they're derogating from key human rights. Many others haven't, and many have hidden provisions in health and sanitation bills. So a key challenge for all of us who are going to be affected by these trends is going to be understanding exactly what powers have been introduced and how to hold states to account on the sunset clauses they've included. But for more broadly, I'd like to sort of focus on how this sort of epidemic of emergency powers is going to affect development and humanitarian groups in particular. Lena, can I have the next slide? We're seeing particular challenges for the humanitarian sector. We're seeing humanitarian language being used to legitimize containment and repression. We're seeing that states are often failing to exempt civil society organisations from curfews, stay-at-home orders, and other restrictions on movement, which in turn is preventing them from delivering life-saving services. Examples of that are where organisations have been blocked from providing COVID-19 medical aid and relief in Burkina Faso and Belize, and in Rwanda, where authorities have arrested aid workers for violating social distancing orders while they were trying to distribute food in low-income neighbourhoods. Next slide, please. I think Mandeep has already mentioned the implications of COVID-19 around access to information and disinformation. And we've seen in more than a dozen countries, both INGOs and local partners engaged in the COVID response are being affected by criminal penalties or enforcement of pre-existing fake news laws intended to stifle criticism of the government response to the pandemic. One of the most stark examples of this is in Zimbabwe, where an official was given a prison sentence of up to 20 years for false statements after criticising the government's pandemic strategy. Next slide, please. A final issue that I'd like to sort of focus on is going to be the inclusion now of public health under the rubric of securitisation. I think for many of us, the UN body that we're all focused on is the WHO. But what we've realised through research we've commissioned at FIX, that alongside the Financial Action Task Force, there are over 200 bodies that have some kind of mandate for security and counterterrorism, whose work potentially could also restrict civic space. There's a whole cluster of those focused around technological responses, but also a cluster around global health. And many of those are going to be seeking to demonstrate their relevance in the post-pandemic context and are pivoting their focus to public health, which is also going to have implications for development and humanitarian actors. I think we'd already seen what the beginnings of the intersection between public health, technology and securitisation looked like in the context of Ebola, but we're extremely concerned as you see the mass introduction of this approach globally, that this is going to seriously undermine rights-based approaches to combating pandemics. It's going to involve imposing top-down control and surveillance rather than the grassroots upwards community-led responses that we know are so effective in combating public health crises. In terms of how we're trying to work on those intersections at FIX, we're working very closely with data rights experts who are concerned about the use of these intrusive surveillance technologies. With them, we're looking at whether there's scope for states to bring in regulation. The challenge at the moment is that many governments and civil society are not being able to keep up with the scale of tech innovation. And we're also looking at working with technologists, humanitarian actors, environmental groups and civil liberties groups about creating new alliances to track what this trend means for our collective work. Next slide, please. So I just want to conclude in terms of what actions we can take. Although many people have compared the pandemic to 9/11, in some ways it's starkly different. And I think that the key difference here is that although the measures following 9/11 ended up leading to mass human rights abuses against populations in particular countries and particular communities, particularly Muslims, the emergency response to the pandemic has affected all of us. It has manifested differently, but has affected all of us across regions, across class. And it's a unique moment to claim back the discourse around human rights and security, and to reshape it based on human rights values. So we are, along with other funders, looking at strategies that could be supported particularly at building alliances between the different sectors and movements that are going to be affected by securitisation. We'd really like to see how we can build on the joint work of human rights, development, humanitarian groups that have been working on Financial Action Task Force and issues of bank de-risking, and how they can also pivot their focus to some of these other bodies that we're identifying whose policies are going to have real implications for civic space down the line. Building on that, we'd also like to see how we can work together in terms of advocacy at the national level and influencing our development and foreign policy departments. And I know that the British government in particular has been very proud of the work it did in relation to FATF and bank de-risking. This is a real opportunity, as Rowan was saying, for a joined-up response around foreign policy and development, and not just looking at administrative issues, but looking at the implications of UK trade policies, for example, export controls on exporting surveillance technology, spyware, or hardware for security forces, as in a context where we anticipate that protest is going to be increasingly criminalised. We'd like to work together across sectors on issues of data rights and privacy, and see whether there's scope to challenge techno-solutionism and securitized responses through litigation or exposure of the private actors that seek to benefit at this moment. And I think finally, the last couple of bullet points are really around this being an opportunity to disrupt long-standing narratives about safety and security. Following 9/11, security elites, political elites, have had the upper hand in shaping that discourse and being able to say that they had to take the lead in designing counterterrorism policies, because so much of the information that they sat on was private, was confidential, was highly sensitive. We're now in a moment where we are all unified in our experience of this pandemic. It's a crisis that brings in the voices of not just security experts, but also public health professionals, development experts, humanitarian experts, and also those who are looking at the next wave of crises we're going to have over the next decade around climate and environmental issues. There's a real opportunity, and there's a nascent conversation taking place about how we shift the narrative around security and use that as an entry point to question how governments are prioritizing expenditure in the name of building resilience and security. And I think finally, what we're anticipating is a real opportunity to develop a shared vision around democracy, around security and the economy, and the work on securitization is one route into this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Poonam, and thank you to Mandeep as well. I thought those two presentations complement each other really well. Mandeep, it was really good to hear a kind of very comprehensive overview of what's happening now and the challenges that we're facing and what we as civil society need to push for. And Poonam, thank you for going into the drivers that have been, pushing forward this problem over the past few years and are intensifying at the moment. So we've got 4 questions in the question and answer box at the moment, so we'll start by going through them. I will read them out, and Poonam and Mandeep can answer them. If you have any questions, please do add them in that box. I think that's going to be the best way to run this. So the first question that we received was about fragile and conflict affected states like Yemen. So what's needed to ensure conflict sensitive responses while ensuring civic space is listened to and prioritised in those places at the moment?
So Ron, if that's okay, I can take a stab at that.
Thank you.
So thank you, Akram, for that question. One thing it's important to just keep in mind is that fundamental civic freedoms are extremely important, and people still continue to have those rights. There are certain limitations under international law that are allowed, but it's important that that fundamental civic freedoms need to be protected in all circumstances. So it's important that that balance between public safety, and civic freedoms needs to be maintained. The other question that I'm just responding to is that that in a conflict situation, the UN Secretary General has issued a ceasefire call in the context of COVID-19, and I think that's really important, where he's urged different parties to conflict to understand that, and I think that's and the role of multilateralism is absolutely critically important, particularly if we want to make sure that rights are upheld in all circumstances.
Thank you, Mandeep. Poonam, would you like to answer that one as well?
I will just add, I guess, a couple of points that we're seeing specifically raising challenges in conflict-affected sort of crisis contexts. And I guess one is stressing the critical importance of access to information, both to civil society organisations and communities who need that information to be able to take necessary measures. And another conflict-affected zone that we haven't spoken about is Kashmir, where there has been a massive crackdown on internet freedoms and a series of internet shutdowns. And we know that has real implications for the ability of those communities to respond. I think the other point that I raise is, I think across the board we've seen this, but I've been aware of this particularly in the context of Libya, is the role of medical professionals. And even in contexts where civil society may be largely focused on service delivery or is very depleted, medical and aid professionals who are otherwise trying to present themselves as being impartial, because of their role in drawing attention to the shortcomings of government responses, are coming under fire and are being sort of politicized and treated like civic or political actors. I think in terms of when we're thinking about preserving civic space in those contexts, to think very broadly around this range of civic actors that are coming under attack and the specific protections they need in addition to CSOs and NGOs.
Great, thank you, Poonam. So the next question we have is around the bad guys. Who are the bad guys? So we're talking about bad actors as some of the usual suspects, but we need to recognise that on issues such as climate change, some of the worst offenders are our own governments. How do we move away from a securitized Cold War language of Russia, China equals good, or Russia, China equals bad, and we are good? And that's a question from Alistair. Poonam, would you like to take that one first?
Yes. I mean, it's an excellent point, and I think in the report that we produced, there was a very strong focus not just on malign actors trying to push for erosion of democracy or the far right or the populist right, but it was very much looking at the status quo, and that includes both Western democracies and neoliberal actors. So I think it is a sort of complex picture. I think the situation is that many of our allies are not our allies on these issues. And although the strategies they use may not be as repressive as the Chinas and the Israels and the Russias, there are often ties between them. I mean, we know Israeli surveillance spyware organizations supply tools to both sort of Western and repressive contexts. But there is going to be a need to examine the different ways both economic and Western democracies are suppressing critical civic engagement around issues like climate. I think the challenge has been, and I know about this in terms of sort of past engagement with the UK, they will deftly say, but we're not Russia, why are you sort of talking about us in the same breath? I think what's going to be absolutely important is actually sort of documenting developments like the ones we saw last year around Extinction Rebellion. It's going to be keeping open the space for protest and making sure that although even all democracies, all governments in a public health situation are able to derogate from rights, that we remain really on the ball in making sure that they only introduce those measures and use them in sort of proportionate ways. I think going back to that narratives point, there is this sort of opportunity to recast the narrative around security, and in that also kind of draw attention to the way that Western democracies have been sort of very happy to enable that discourse to continue. In a report that we're going to be sort of publishing in the next couple of months, we've been working with the UN Special Rapporteur on who's financing the UN architecture around counterterrorism. And the reality is that Western democracies have ceded that space to states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And I think, as Alistair's saying, it's not a kind of, there isn't a sort of diametric opposition. It isn't the Saudis and the Qataris are the bad guys and the Western democracies are trying to challenge that. The reality is that the Western democracies have ceded that space willingly and are not willing to be coherent in terms of robustly challenging the implications of that. So that's something that we definitely need to think about and act on.
Thank you, Poonam. Mandeep, is there anything that you would like to add on that?
So, as a global alliance that's deeply rooted in the global South, I think we of course might see things slightly differently, and but yet there are certain governments that have the promotion of human rights and democratic values as an integral part of their foreign policy. And as Poonam said, some of those governments have ceded space, and there is almost a crisis of multilateralism that is taking place at this point of time, where different governments have exercised their geostrategic interests on the international sphere in extremely selfish and self-serving ways, where and they've and some have pushed multilateralism and talked about a rules-based international order because it suits their trade interests or the debts that other countries owe them. But when it comes to human rights, they always talk about state sovereignty and not people sovereignty. And there are others that have sought to impose their own will and on other countries and sought to intervene, when governance has failed or when there have been abuses committed in certain countries whose political ideologies they don't agree with, while their own allies are gross abusers of human rights and continue to buy arms and fuel conflicts around the world. So we are really in a real, in a time where there's a real crisis or a paucity of visionary international leadership, and it's so strange that it is happening in this 75 years of the UN, and this tussle is taking place between great powers and also between other countries that are not coming together in a way to promote multilateralism in the way that we want to see, or for the purposes of the UN Charter. Multilateralism was established, and that's why I think it's really important for us to continue to focus on universal human rights values, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But there is hope. I think COVID-19, has shown hope. There have been, leaders, and actually there have been several women leaders in the feminist mold who have, who have shown a better approach to addressing many of these national issues, which are definitely influenced by international events.
Great, thank you. So the next question we have is a more specific question for Poonam. So the question is from Margaret, and it is: photographers in the UK have been reporting misuse of counterterrorism legislation to prohibit legitimate street photography. Has this, has this been reflected more generally around the world as well?
Actually, the answer to that is I don't know. So it's a very, very short. I think we're aware of kind of broader restrictions on media freedoms, but I haven't come across documented sort of cases of bans on street photography. It's something we can certainly look into, and I don't know if Mandeep has come across that in Civic's research.
About the misuse of counterterror legislation?
It's around misuse of counterterrorism legislation to restrict legitimate street photography.
So I would say this follows usual patterns in a sense. I mean, legitimate street photography is one aspect of the exercise of civic freedoms. And there have been instances where protest movements of people people who've been opposing government responses to situations through mass mobilizations, how counterterrorism legislation has been repurposed. So there is a general trend, certainly, on this. Now, I'm not qualified enough to talk about what's happening in the UK, but generally, definitely there is a tendency, and this and I think somebody this trend tends to play out in other places too.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is from Patricia, and this is: have you come across positive examples of governments including civil society organisations and or communities in their decision-making responses to the pandemic? Mandeep, shall we start with you? Oh, Mandeep appears to have frozen. Poonam, can we go to you? So have you come across any positive examples?
I think one trend I'd like to highlight, and it's not so much sort of communities, but a particular set of civic actors, and that's the role of labour rights organisers and unions. And I think after certainly a couple of decades of certainly both states and private actors delegitimising labour rights organising and unions, but also workers themselves not seeing unions as kind of relevant in certainly kind of many developed economy contexts. What you've seen is a kind of resurgence and elevation of the role of unions as a sort of key interlocutor between governments and workers in the context of the economic response that governments had to mount. I think what we've also seen is a sort of an emergence of new forms of worker organising, particularly in the informal sector, in the gig economy, but even within the tech sector. So I think for us, that's been one of the most sort of promising developments. We know at the same time there have been sustained attacks on labour rights activists in contexts like Cambodia. So it's a complex picture, but a kind of very interesting one. And I think a sort of flowing on from that, I think the next sort of development that we've seen is a massive increase in an interest in solidarity and alliance building between both environmental and labour rights activists. And I think for us, from a sort of funding perspective, the kind of key challenge is going to be how to resource those alliances and partnerships at this moment. I'd say even beyond that, we work a lot with feminist, LGBTI, sexual reproductive rights groups who are wanting to get engaged in broader discussions around democracy, wanting to develop shared visions with those looking at alternative economic models, for example, or workers' rights. We see the kind of resurgence of a focus on the solidarity or care economy. So there are these kind of real openings and actors stepping into that space. I guess the key challenge is going to be whether, as has been the case for some unions, the degree to which those organisers are able to actually access the spaces where decisions are being made right now.
Thank you, Poonam. Mandeep, can you hear us again?
Yes, I can. My apologies, I got frozen. So on positive examples, yes, there are a few positive examples how governments have responded. In Sierra Leone, there's a government-led platform that's enabled civil society to interact with the president and relevant ministers on COVID-19 efforts, so which allows activists to have direct access to and coordination with the ministries of health, finance, and emergency response. In Paraguay, the government has set up a website that allows the public to track COVID-19 expenditure and directly engage with public officials. In South Africa, the National Lotteries Commission has released an amount of 150 million rand as a relief measure for NGOs to assist them to implement services aligned with the fund's objectives to prevent and detect, care, and support communities and in relation to COVID-19, so prevent COVID-19. In Lithuania, associations and foundations that lease their property from the municipality or municipality pre-controlled entities have been entitled to a waiver and reduction in rent payments and penalties imposed on delayed payments. So there are governments that have stepped up to the plate in relation to supporting civil society and to serve especially excluded and impoverished communities at this point of time.
Thank you, Mandeep. That's great. And it's so encouraging to hear that things are going well in some places. And I think it's so important that we champion those examples. So our next question is from Maria, and that's about what's happening in Malawi and Zimbabwe. Maria, we had hoped to have a human rights defender from Malawi on this webinar, but unfortunately he had to drop out, and because what's happening there is so interesting. But Maria's question is, may I please ask how COVID and the associated restrictions are impacting freedom of expression and access to information in Southern African countries like Malawi and Zimbabwe in particular? I don't know if either of you are able to respond to that.
So thank you for that question. I'm afraid I'm not following directly the events, and perhaps it might be, it would be good if someone who's on the ground there can certainly offer a perspective, perhaps maybe from among the participants. But what we have usually seen is that governments that are respectful of civic freedoms, governments that are that have been more open have followed that trend, but governments that have usually not been respectful of civic freedoms, that have excluded civil society, have used the occasion to further restrict civic freedoms, and so that existing fault lines have been further exacerbated. I know that there were some concerns in South Africa about a government regulation that said that anybody spreading false information intentionally would face sanctions, legal sanctions, and that itself, on the face of it, might sound benign, but I think it could, it is worrying in a sense that it could set the stage for restrictions and censorship of information. Again, I mean, there are serious concerns about spread of false information that is there, but I think we just need to balance public safety concerns with civic freedoms in all such instances. So I will just say this. So apologies if I can't, on the specificities of Zimbabwe and Malawi, I'm not able to respond to that.
And do you know anything more about what's happening on the ground there?
I think not much more than Mandeep, and I think I mentioned the law in Zimbabwe earlier, and I think one of those key characteristics of closing space tends to be sort of contagion, and you often see a sort of flurry of copycat laws around restrictions on freedom of expression and cyber freedoms, which we've seen in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa before, for example, Eastern Africa. I think one of the things that would be very interesting to look into, and I don't know, I know certainly this is the case with Zimbabwe, and I don't know if it's the case with a number of the other Southern African countries, is in a sense where the kind of know-how and the capacity comes to introduce these laws, and where it also involves some form of surveillance, where that capacity comes from. And we know that the Chinese government and tech companies have been a key exporter of sort of technology infrastructure to a number of Belt and Road countries, including in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's well documented by some of the US think tanks, how the export of that hardware and know-how has also gone hand in hand with those states then introducing restrictive legislation. And there's some very interesting work being done at Carnegie Endowment at the moment around digital repression and understanding the factors that lead to some states over others restricting expression and using digital technologies to do that. And so nascent work around a network of activists, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, to ensure that they're equipped to track and work on these issues. And that's something I could share with you afterwards if any of the audience are interested.
Thank you, Poonam. Okay, so we have a question from Charles. So in governance and social accountability programs, often sharing stories about positive citizen engagement helping to shift citizenry attitudes on engaging with the state. The closure of civic space poses major challenges for the community groups and service monitoring. Big donors and the bank are being fairly quiet on this. What can we do to push them? Mandeep, would you like to start with that one?
I'm sorry, I lost that question. I don't see it in the chat. Yes.
I'll read it out again. So in governance and social accountability programs, the closure of civic space poses major challenges for community groups and service monitoring. Big donors and the banks are being fairly quiet on this. What can we do to push them?
I think the first and most important thing that we need to do is to ensure that the funds reach them on the ground, and that that they are able to get the vast majority of funds, and the supply lines need to be need to be ensured that need to be sort of made leaner in a sense. That's absolutely critical. The other thing is it's important that in some instances, actually, community-based groups have really proven their value, particularly in these times, because many governments have actually been unable to feed their populations or been able to provide basic services to them in this time, and civil society organizations, particularly on the ground, have actually have actually supplemented government efforts, or even lack of, in some instances they've actually filled a huge gap. With the big donors or with the international financial institutions, definitely on the macro level, there is definitely their messaging which speaks, but there are some serious issues, structural issues there. I think their tendency is in the past is really to work through governments, and civil society engagement is usually seen as an add-on. It's an appendage, really, and that needs to shift, and particularly and many of the in international financial institutions continue to do business with governments that actually actively restrict and repress civil society, and although they have certain programs that show that they are taking civic space issues into account, they're still not taking them seriously enough. So I think that is something that we really need to work with both the donors and with government and with financial institutions to get them to recognize the importance of civil society and the importance of local civil society. It's not just the big international NGOs who already have privileged access to these institutions, but really it's the small organizations that need access to resources and also access to policy making.
Thank you, Mandeep. Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes left. So Poonam, would you like to respond to that question? If not, I will close.
I guess just very briefly to say, it's a very interesting moment after several years of delegitimization of local civic actors and NGOs. We have a moment where communities have seen the value of these organizations, and the innovation and their commitment, and stepping above what could be expected, particularly after years of having come under attack. And so there's an opportunity to shift that narrative around civil society, and make the case for its legitimacy, but also its ability to meet local needs. That moment is coinciding where so many of these groups, both locally and internationally, are in financial crisis. And so I think that's going to be a key challenge for the big donors, to what degree they may well engage in the rhetoric of praising the proliferation of civic organising and engagement, but are they willing? I know it's a very difficult moment financially, but are they at this moment willing to ensure the sustainability of the whole ecosystem of civil society that's needed?
Great, thank you. And I think that's a good note to end it on. Mandeep, do you have any final reflections at all?
thank you very much. It's been it's been a learning experience for me, particularly through the questions and through Poonam's presentation and your introduction, Roman. So thank you very much for this initiative. One thing I would just leave us with a thought is that COVID-19 also presents us an opportunity to actually create something better forward, and this really is a time for us to demand better and fairer societies, to set the stage for policies that serve the needs of people, and particularly those who are excluded. So I think that's something that we need to continue to push for, and civic space is going to be absolutely integral if you're going to have policies that serve the interests of people rather than privileged elites going forward.
Thank you. And Poonam, do you have any very short final reflections to add?
Just to really thank all of you and echo what Mandeep said. Civic space is going to be the oxygen that's required to do the kind of visionary work that Mandeep is talking about. And from a funder perspective, we really want to see philanthropy stepping up at this point to resource civil society to take on this role.
Great, and thank you both so much for your time. Your presentations were fascinating, and this is such an urgent topic. For those of you who are bond members or part of UK civil society, please do join our working group on civic space, where we're going to be carrying on this conversation over the coming months and hopefully years. As I said at the beginning, we'll be recording this webinar, and we will share the recording and the slides afterwards. So please watch out for those. And thank you very much, everyone, for your questions and for joining us online and taking part in this important conversation. And with that, I'm going to close. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.